Chapter 9, Part 2. You will each write an essay to be handed to me on the ways you recognize and kill werewolves. I want 2 rolls of parchment on the subject, and I want them by Monday morning. It is time somebody took this class in hand. Weasley, stay behind. We need to arrange your detention. Harry and Hermione left the room with the rest of the class, who waited until they were well out of earshot, then burst into furious tirade about Snape. Snape's never been like this with any of our other defense arts teachers, even if he did want the job, Harry said to Hermione. Why would he get it in for what? Why has he got it in for Lupin? Do you think it's all because of the Bogart? I don't know, said Hermione pensively. But I really hope Professor Lupin gets better soon. Ron caught up with them 5 minutes later in a towering rage. Do you know what that? He called Snape something that made Hermione say, Ron! It's making me do? I've got to scrub out the bedpans in the hospital wing without magic. He was breathing deeply and his fists clenched. Why couldn't Black have hidden in Snape's office, eh? He could have finished him off for us. Harry woke extremely early the next morning, so early that it was still dark. For a moment, he thought it was roaring of the wind had woken him up, and then he felt a cold breeze in the back of his neck. Sat bolt upright. Peeves, the poltergeist, had been floating next to him, blowing hard in his ear. What'd you do that for? Said Harry furiously. Peeves puffed out his cheeks, blew hard, and zoomed backward out of the room, cackling. Harry fumbled for his alarm clock and looked at it. It was 4:30. Cursing Peeves, he rolled over and tried to get back to sleep, but it was very difficult now that he was awake to ignore the wind against the castle walls, the distant creaking of the trees in the forbidden forest. In a few hours, he would be out on the Quidditch field, battling through that gale. Finally, he gave up any thought of more sleep, got dressed, picked up his Nimbus 2000, and walked quietly out of the dormitory. As Harry opened the door, something brushed against his leg. He bent down just in time to grab Crookshanks by the end of his bushy tail and drag him outside. You know, I reckon Ron was right about you, Harry told Crookshanks suspiciously. There are plenty of mice around this place. Go and chase them. Go on, he added, nudging Crookshanks down the spiral staircase with his foot. Leave Scabbers alone. The noise of the storm was even louder in the Coleman room. Harry knew better than to think the match would be cancelled. Quidditch matches were called off for trifles like thunderstorms. Nevertheless, he was starting to feel a little very apprehensive. Wood was a 5th year and a lot bigger than Harry. Seekers are usually light and speedy, but Diggory's weight should be an advantage in this weather, because he was less likely to be blown off course. Harry whiled away the hours until dawn in front of the fire, getting up every now and then to stop Crookshanks from sneaking up the boys' staircase again. At long last, Harry thought it must be time for breakfast, so he had headed through the portrait a hole alone. Stand and fight, you mangy cur, yelled Cardigan. Oh, shut up, Harry yawned. He writhed a bit over a large bowl of porridge, and by the time he started on toast, the rest of the team had turned up. It's going to be a rough one, said Wood, who wasn't eating anything. Stop worrying, Oliver, said Alicia soothingly. We don't mind a bit of rain. But it was considerably more than a bit of rain. Such was the popularity of Quidditch that the whole school turned out to watch the match as usual. But they ran down the lawn towards the Quidditch field, heads down against the ferocious wind, umbrellas whipping out of their hands as they went. Just before they entered the locker room, Harry saw Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle laughing and pointing at him from under the enormous umbrella. They were on their way to the stadium. The teens changed into their scarlet robes and waited for Wood's usual pre-match pep talk, but it didn't come. He tried to speak several times, made an odd gulping noise, and then shook his head, hoping to beckon them to follow. The wind was so strong that they staggered sideways and walked onto the field. The crowd was cheering. They couldn't hear it over the fresh rolls of thunder. Rain was splattering over Harry's glasses. How on earth was he going to catch a snitch in this? The Hufflepuffs were approaching from the opposite side of the field, wearing canary yellow robes. When the captains walked up to each other, shook hands, Diggory smiled at Wood, but Wood now looked as though he had lockjaw, merely nodded. Harry saw Madam Hooch's mouth form the words, "Mount your brooms." He pulled his right foot out of the mud with a squelch of a swug over his Nimbus 2000. Madam Hooch put her whistle to her lips and gave it a blast that sounded shrill in distance, and they were off. Harry rose fast, with his Nimbus swerving slightly with the wind. He had held as steady as he could and turned, squinting into the rain. Within 5 minutes, Harry was soaked to the skin and frozen, hardly able to see his teammates, let alone a tiny snitch. He flew backwards and forward across the field, past blurred red and yellow shapes, had no idea of what was happening to the rest of the game. He couldn't hear the commentary over the wind. The crowd was hidden beneath their set of sea of cloaks and battered umbrellas. Twice Harry came very close to being unseated by a bludger, whose vision was too clouded for the rain to see his glasses. He hadn't seen them coming. He lost track of time. He was getting harder and harder to hold on his broom straight. The sky was getting darker, as though the night had decided to come early. Twice Harry hit another player without knowing whether it was a teammate or an opponent. Everyone was now so wet and the rain was so thick you could hardly tell them apart. With the first flash of lightning came the sound of Madam Hooch's whistle. Harry couldn't see the outline of Wood through the thick rain, gesturing him to the ground. The whole team splashed into the mud. "I call for a timeout," Wood roared at his team. "Come on, under here." They huddled under the edge of the field with a large umbrella. Harry took off his glasses and wiped them hurriedly on his robes. "What's the score?" "We're 50 points up," said Wood. "But unless we get that snitch soon, we'll be playing into the night." "I got no chance with these," Harry said exasperately, waving his glasses. At that very moment, Hermione appeared at his shoulder. She was holding a cloak over her head and was explicitly gleaming. "I have an idea, Harry. Give me your glasses, quick." She handed them to her, and as the team watched in amazement, Hermione tapped them with her wand. "Impervious." "There," she said, handing them back to Harry. "They'll repel water." Wood looked as though he could have kissed her. "Brilliant," he called out hoarsely, after they disappeared from the crowd. "Okay, team, let's go for it." Hermione's spell had done the trick. Harry was still numb with his cold, and still wetter than he'd ever been in his entire life, but he could see. Full of fresh determination, he urged the broom through the turbulent air, every direction for the snitch, avoiding the bludger, ducking beneath Diggory, who was stretching out the opposite direction. There was another clap of thunder, followed immediately by forked lightning. It was getting more and more dangerous. Harry needed to get that snitch quickly. He turned, intending to head back towards the middle field, but at that moment another flash of lightning illuminated the stands, and Harry saw something that distracted him completely. The silhouette of an enormous shaggy dog, clearly imprinted against the sky, motionless in the topmost empty row of the seats. Harry's numb hand slipped from his broom handle, and his Nimbus dropped a few feet. Shaking his sodden bangs out of his eyes, he squinted back the stands. The dog had vanished. "Harry!" came Wood's squish from yell. "Gryffindor goalpost! Harry, behind you!" He looked wildly around. Cedric was pelting up for the field. A tiny speck of gold was shimmering with the rain filled with air between them. With a jolt of panic, Harry threw himself flat on the broom, zoomed towards the snitch. "Come on!" he growled as his Nimbus whipped faster. Something odd was happening. An eerie silence was falling across the stadium. The wind, through the strong as ever, was forgetting to roar, as though someone had turned off the sound, and though Harry had gone suddenly deaf. What was going on? And then horrible, familiar cold swept him inside. He had just became aware of something moving on the field below. Before he had time to think, Harry had taken his eyes off the snitch to look down. At least 100 Dementors, their hidden faces pointing up at him, were standing beneath him. It was all freezing water were rising in his chest and insides, and he heard it again. Someone screaming inside his head. A woman. Not Harry, no, not Harry, please, not Harry. Stand aside, you silly girl, stand aside now. Not Harry, please, take me, kill me instead. Numbing and swirling, white mist filling Harry's brain. What was he doing? Why was he flying? He needed help her. He was going to die. She was going to be murdered. He was falling and falling from the icy mist. Not Harry, please, have mercy, have mercy. The shrill voice was laughing and the woman was screaming, and Harry knew no more. Luckily, the ground was soft. I thought he was dead for sure, but he didn't even break his glasses. Harry could hear voices whispering, but they made no sense whatsoever. He didn't have a clue as to where he was, or how he'd got there, or what he'd been doing before he got there. All he knew was that every inch of him was aching, as though he'd been beaten. That was the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life. The scariest thing. Hooded black figures, cold, screaming. Harry's eyes snapped open. He was lying in the hospital wing. The Gryffindor Quidditch team, spattered with mud from head to foot, was gathered around his bed. Ron and Hermione were also there, looking as though they had just climbed out of a swimming pool. Harry, said Fred, who looked extremely white underneath the mud. How are you feeling? It was as though Harry's memory was on fast forward. The lightning, Grim, Snitch, and the Dementors. What happened? He said, sitting up suddenly as they all gasped. You fell off, said Fred. Must have been, 50 feet? We thought you died, said Alicia, who was shaking. Hermione made a small, squeaking noise. Her eyes were extremely bloodshot. But the match, said Harry. What happened? Are we doing a replay? No one said anything. The horrible truth sank into him like stone. We didn't lose. Diggory got the snitch, said George, just after you fell. He didn't realize what happened. When he looked back and he saw you on the ground, he tried to call it off. Wanted a rematch, but they won fair and square. Even Wood admits it. Where's Wood? Said Harry, suddenly realizing he wasn't there. Still in the shower, said Fred. He thinks he's trying to drown himself. Harry put his face in his knees and his hands gripping his hair. Fred grabbed his shoulder and looked at him roughly. Come on, Harry. You've never missed the snitch before. There had to be one time you didn't get it, said George. It's not over yet, said Fred. We lost by 100 points, right? So if Hufflepuff loses to Ravenclaw, we'll beat Ravenclaw and then Slytherin. Hufflepuff have to lose by at least 200 points, said George. But if they beat Ravenclaw, no way. Ravenclaw's too good. But if Slytherin loses against Hufflepuff, it all depends on the points. A margin of 100 either way. Harry lay there, not saying a word. They had lost. For the first time ever, he had lost a Quidditch match. And for 10 minutes or so, Madame Pomfrey came over to tell the team they had to leave him in peace. We'll come and see you later, Fred told him. Don't beat yourself up, Harry. You still are the best seeker we've ever had. The team trooped out, trailing mud behind them. Madame Pomfrey shut the door behind them, looking disapprovingly. Ron and Hermione moved near to Harry's bed. Dumbledore was really angry, Hermione said in a quaking voice. I've never seen him like that before. He ran onto the field when you fell, waved his wand, and you sort of slowed down before you hit the ground. Then he whirled his wand at the Dementors, shot silver stuff at them, and he left them at the stadium right away. He was furious they'd come into the grounds. We heard him. Then he magicked you onto a stretcher, said Ron, and he walked up the school with you floating on it. Everyone thought you were... His voice faded out, but Harry hardly noticed. He was thinking about the Dementors had done to him. About the screaming voice. He looked up and saw Ron and Hermione looking at him so anxiously that he quickly cast around for something matter-of-fact to say. Did someone get my nimbus? Ron and Hermione looked quickly at each other. What? Said Harry, looking from one another. Well, when you fell off, it got blown away, said Hermione hesitantly. And it hit. It hit. Oh, Harry. The Whomping Willow. Harry's inside lurched. The Whomping Willow was a very violent tree that stood alone in the middle of the grounds. And, he said, dreading the answer, well, you know the Whomping Willow, said Ron. It doesn't like being hit. Professor Flitwick brought it back just before you came around, said Hermione in a very small voice. Slowly she reached down at the bag of her feet, turned it upside down, and ripped a dozen pieces of splintered wood and twigs onto the bed. Only the remains of Harry's faithful, finely beaten broomstick.